I remember the exact moment I realized we were all going to die. Not in the glorious charge the propaganda reels promised, not beneath the Emperor's golden light with hymns on our lips, but slowly, methodically, ground down by an enemy we couldn't see and orders that made less sense with each passing day. It was when Commissar Valen stopped shooting the deserters. That's when I knew. A commissar who won't execute is a commissar who's already chosen his own bullet, who's already seen past the veil of duty and found nothing but void on the other side. But by then it was too late for any of us. By then we were already 6 months into the Keswick Valley campaign, 6 months into what High Command called a minor pacification action, on a world whose name I'd never heard before. They loaded us onto the transport ships, and whose dust I'd breathe until my lungs turned to concrete. The journey from the mustering grounds took 43 days. I counted them, scratching marks into the metal bulkhead beside my berth in the troop deck, each line a day closer to whatever waited for us on Helethos the Force. The ship smelled like sweat and gun oil and the recycled air that passed through too many bodies before it reached your mouth. Air that tasted metallic and flat, that never quite filled your lungs properly. We were packed in so tight you couldn't extend your arms without touching another guardsman, 3,000 of us in a hold designed for half that, the Departamento Munitorum having decided that shipping efficiency mattered more than comfort. Not that anyone complained. Comfort was a word from before, from civilian life, from that other existence where you had choices and privacy, and the belief that your life held some inherent value beyond the ammunition you could carry and the ground you could hold. I was a corporal then, Corporal Hessen of the 74th Ithacan Light Infantry, promoted after our last sergeant caught a lass round through the throat on Valdis Prime. I hadn't wanted the promotion. Stripes made you responsible, made you count the faces before and after every engagement, made you write the names in the company log with your own hand when someone didn't come back. But the alternative was a disciplinary charge for refusing orders, and I'd seen what they did to guardsmen who refused orders. The punishment battalions didn't come back. They were spent like ammunition, hurled at the hardest positions until nothing remained but meat and the memory of what defiance cost. Commissar Valen had joined us 3 weeks before embarkation, replacing Commissar Holt, who died in what the official report called an unfortunate accident involving a misfiring heavy bolter, and what everyone else knew was fragging. Holt had executed 17 men in 2 months, including a sergeant who'd questioned why we were ordering fixed bayonet charges against fortified positions. The commissar's chainsword had taken the sergeant's head clean off in the middle of the mess hall, blood spraying across the ration trays, while Holt quoted from the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer about the virtue of unquestioning obedience. 3 days later, someone had ensured that heavy bolter barrel was pointed the wrong direction during a training exercise. The Munitorum didn't investigate too closely. Dead commissars were bad for morale, but so were the ones who executed too freely. And I suppose someone in high command had calculated that Holt's particular brand of zealotry was creating more problems than it solved. Valen was different from the start. Younger, for one thing, probably no more than 30 standard years, with a face that hadn't yet developed the permanent scowl most commissars wore like a second uniform. He had grey eyes that actually looked at you rather than through you, that seemed to see past the uniform to the person underneath, which was either compassion or a more sophisticated form of manipulation. His greatcoat was immaculate, black wool without a single thread out of place, his bolt pistol polished to a mirror shine, his cap sitting at the regulation angle. But there was something in the way he moved, a hesitation before he spoke, as though he was constantly editing his words before they left his mouth, considering and reconsidering every syllable. The other commissars I'd known spoke in proclamations, absolute statements that brooked no discussion. Valen spoke in sentences that sometimes trailed off, questions that he didn't always seem to expect answers to. He introduced himself to each squad personally during the voyage, memorizing names and homeworlds, asking about our families in a way that felt genuine rather than like an interrogation technique. When he reached my squad, He spent nearly 15 minutes talking to Private Corvin about beekeeping on an agri-world I'd never heard of, nodding along as Corvin explained the difference between harvest honey and fighting honey. Whatever that meant, I watched Valen's face during that conversation and saw no calculation there, no strategic assessment of morale factors and unit cohesion metrics. He seemed genuinely interested in the minutiae of apiary management on a backwater planet 10,000 light-years from anything that mattered. It was unsettling. Commissars weren't supposed to be interested in your life before the Guard. Your life began when you took the oath and ended when you stopped being useful. Everything else was distraction from duty. We made planetfall on Helithos 4s during the morning cycle, the transport ships dropping into a rust-colored sky, thick with particulate matter from the ongoing industrial operations that had made this world valuable enough to fight over. The planet was a mining colony, barely terraformed, with a thin atmosphere that required respirator augmentation for prolonged exposure. The locals, what few remained, were pale, stunted things, adapted over generations to the low oxygen and heavy metals in the air. They watched us disembark with flat expressions, neither hostile nor welcoming, just observing as 10,000 Imperial Guardsmen offloaded from the bellies of vast ships and began establishing the forward operating base that would be our home for the next 6 months. The briefing came 3 hours after landing, delivered by a colonel whose name I never learned, a man with salt and pepper hair and a facial tic that made his left eye twitch every few seconds. He stood before a hololithic projection of the valley, the grainy blue image showing a narrow corridor between two mountain ranges, approximately 40 kilometers long and never more than 5 wide at its widest point. The enemy, and he said, enemy, the way you might say vermin or mechanical failure, as though they were an unfortunate obstacle rather than thinking beings had established fortifications at the far end of the valley. Our objective was to advance down the valley, neutralize enemy positions, and secure the lithium processing facilities at the valley's terminus. Simple, direct, the kind of operation the Imperial Guard had executed 10,000 times on 10,000 worlds. What the briefing didn't mention, what we learned through the usual channels of rumor and scuttlebutt that flowed through any military unit, was that 3 previous regiments had been sent into Keswick Valley. None had made it more than 15 kilometers. The enemy, later we learned they were separatist militias, former PDF units, who'd rejected imperial rule during some political upheaval I didn't understand and didn't care to, had turned the valley into a killing ground. They had artillery positions in the mountains, sniper nests that could see every meter of the valley floor, automated defense systems left over from the initial colonial mining operations. They didn't need to attack. They just needed to wait, to let us walk into the funnel and then close it behind us. But we didn't know that yet. Not really. We knew it the way you know that smoking low sticks will eventually ruin your lungs, as abstract information that applies to other people in other circumstances. We believed, because we had to believe, that this time would be different, that our regiment would be the one to break through, to justify the casualties and complete the mission. We believed, because the alternative was madness. The advance began on the 3rd day. First company led, heavy weapons teams dispersed through the column, Chimera transports providing mobile cover. We moved in standard formation, squads maintaining 15-meter intervals. Vox operators calling out clear sectors every 100 meters. The valley floor was loose gravel and hardpan, nothing growing except for patches of gray lichen that looked like diseased skin. The mountains on either side rose steep and brutal, bare rock faces with no vegetation to soften their edges. The whole place felt wrong. Felt like walking into a mouth. The valley walls like teeth waiting to close. We were 4 kilometers in when the first casualties came. Not from enemy fire, but from the terrain itself. Private Jessic stepped on what looked like solid ground and plunged through into a sinkhole, the old mining tunnels beneath, collapsing under his weight. We heard him screaming for maybe 30 seconds before the Vox cut out, either from signal loss or because he'd hit bottom. The engineers spent 2 hours trying to map the tunnel network with ground-penetrating radar, but the readings were inconclusive. the subsurface too chaotic with voids and collapses to get accurate data. Command decided we'd proceed with extreme caution, which in practice meant we moved at half speed and lost 3 more men to cave-ins over the next week. The enemy didn't engage us directly at first. They didn't need to. They just watched as we stumbled through their trap, watched as we lost men to the environment, to accidents, to the 1,000 small ways that soldiers die when they're operating in hostile terrain without adequate intelligence or preparation. We'd find signs of them, sometimes expended shell casings, fortified positions that had been abandoned hours before we arrived, propaganda leaflets printed on cheap paper that deteriorated almost immediately in the acrid air. The leaflets said things like, "The Emperor's light burns false," and "The Imperium is a lie, built on your bones." We were ordered to burn them without reading, but of course everyone read them. You can't not look at something you're forbidden to see. Commissar Valen walked the column every day, moving from squad to squad, checking readiness and morale. But he wasn't performing the traditional commissariat functions. He wasn't quoting from the primer or delivering speeches about duty and sacrifice. He was just talking to people, asking how they were holding up, listening to complaints without immediate reprisal. Private Kellen mentioned that his feet were rotting inside his boots from the constant dampness, the morning condensation that never fully evaporated. Instead of calling him weak, Valen made a note in his data slate, and 2 days later, a supply shipment came in with better quality socks and boot powder. It was a small thing, meaningless in the grand scheme of a military campaign, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that we were human beings with human needs, rather than just components in the Imperial war machine. The first real attack came on day 16. We'd stopped for the night, established a perimeter with automated sentry guns, posted guards at 20-meter intervals. I was on watch, 3rd rotation, that dead time between midnight and dawn when your body feels like it's made of lead and keeping your eyes open requires active effort. The attack started with a sound, a low whistle that grew louder, that resolved itself into incoming artillery shells. They hit the center of our position with devastating precision, airbursts that sent shrapnel slicing through tents and flesh with equal ease. The screaming started immediately, men crying out in pain and fear and rage, voices swallowed by the next impact, the next. We returned fire blindly, shooting at muzzle flashes in the mountains, expending thousands of rounds without hitting anything that mattered. The enemy artillery crews were dug in too deep, protected by meters of rock and camouflage that made them nearly impossible to target, even with our most sophisticated Auspex equipment. The bombardment lasted 17 minutes. By the time it stopped, we'd lost 42 men killed and another 73 wounded. Some of them so badly that the Medicaid teams could only pump them full of morphia and wait for them to die. I helped with the casualty collection, dragging bodies to the designated assembly area where the quartermasters would catalogue them for eventual return to their homeworlds or, more likely, for cremation in the mass burners that followed every major Imperial Guard operation. Most of the faces I recognized. These were men I'd trained with, eaten with, shared guard duty with, during long nights, when the only thing keeping you awake was conversation about nothing, about home and family, and all the things you'd left behind. Now they were meat, biological matter to be processed according to regulation, their deaths reduced to entries in a logbook and adjustments to the company roster. Commissar Valen moved through the wounded, offering what comfort he could, which wasn't much. He held the hand of a private whose legs had been blown off at mid-thigh, whispering something I couldn't hear, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been apology. When the private died, Valen closed his eyes with gentle fingers and stood there for a moment, head bowed, before moving to the next casualty. There was no speech about sacrifice, no invocation of the Emperor's glory, just quiet presence with the dying, bearing witness to their end. The colonel called a command meeting after the bombardment. I was there because our lieutenant had taken a piece of shrapnel through his shoulder and was in the Medicaid tent getting stitched back together which made me the ranking member of our platoon by the simple expedient of not being wounded. The meeting took place in what passed for the command bunker, a reinforced tent with camouflage netting and Vox equipment that kept cutting out because the valley's magnetic field interfered with the signal relays. The colonel's eye was twitching more than ever, the tick accelerating until it looked like he was constantly winking. He pointed at the hololithic map with a metal pointer, the tip trembling slightly. Our position was marked in blue, the enemy's known positions in red, and the vast unknown stretches in between in grey. The grey made up most of the map. "We're proceeding according to plan," the colonel said, which was obviously a lie, but a lie that no one would challenge, because challenging it would be admitting that the plan was fundamentally flawed. "High Command expects us to reach the lithium facilities within 30 days. We're 16 days in and have covered 12 kilometers, which puts us slightly behind schedule, but well within acceptable parameters." Acceptable parameters. 42 dead and counting was acceptable. I wondered what unacceptable would look like, whether there was a number of casualties that would make High Command reconsider this operation, or whether we'd just keep feeding men into the valley until we either broke through or ran out of soldiers. "Intelligence suggests the enemy is operating with limited resources," the colonel continued. "The bombardment was likely their last significant ammunition expenditure. We can expect lighter resistance as we advance." It was Commissar Valen who spoke up, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the tent. "Sir, respectfully, the intelligence assessment seems inconsistent with observed enemy behavior. They've demonstrated sophisticated tactical planning and significant material reserves. If they're limited, they're not showing it." The tent went silent. "You didn't contradict a colonel. You especially didn't contradict a colonel when you were a commissar, because commissars were supposed to enforce unquestioning obedience, not model critical thinking." The colonel's eye twitched faster. He stared at Valen for a long moment, something passing between them that I couldn't read. "Your concern is noted, Commissar," the colonel said finally, each word clipped and precise. "However, the intelligence comes from sources above your clearance level. We proceed as ordered." Valen nodded, but I saw the tightness around his mouth, the way his jaw clenched. He didn't believe the intelligence any more than I did, but he was choosing to obey anyway. To follow orders he knew were wrong because the alternative was chaos, was the breakdown of the chain of command that held the Imperial Guard together. But something had shifted in that moment. Some line had been crossed, some boundary between faithful service and blind obedience that once traversed couldn't be uncrossed. We advanced again the next day. The enemy let us come 5 more kilometers before hitting us with a coordinated assault, this time combining artillery with small arms fire from elevated positions. We couldn't retreat because that would mean abandoning equipment and wounded, which was against regulation. We couldn't advance because every meter forward was contested by withering fire, so we dug in, literally, using entrenching tools to carve fighting positions into the rocky ground, creating a static line that stretched across the valley floor. It became a siege without walls, both sides trapped in a stalemate maintained by mutual destruction. We'd send out patrols, and they'd get hit by snipers. They'd probe our lines, and we'd drive them back with massed lasgun fire. Men died every day, not in dramatic charges but in random moments. A shot from nowhere, a poorly placed footstep, a mechanical failure that turned a weapon into a bomb. The casualty list grew, the names blurring together until they lost individual meaning and became just numbers, statistics to be reported up the chain of command and filed away in some archive where no one would ever read them. Commissar Valen stopped wearing his dress uniform. He switched to standard fatigues, the same mud-stained gear the rest of us wore, his greatcoat left behind in his quarters. He grew a beard, which was technically against regulation but which no one commented on because what did regulations matter when you were 20 kilometers into a valley of death with no clear path forward or back? He still carried his bolt pistol, but I never saw him draw it. The traditional commissar's duty of summary execution for cowardice or desertion went unfulfilled, not because there were no candidates, but because Valen seemed to have decided that executing soldiers for wanting to live was somehow worse than letting them harbor doubts. Private Corvin, the beekeeper, deserted on day 32. He walked away from his guard post in the middle of the night, heading not toward enemy lines but perpendicular to them, up into the mountains, where presumably he thought he could find some cave or crevice to hide in until the war moved past him. He made it maybe 300 meters before the automated sentry guns acquired his thermal signature and put a burst through his chest. We found him in the morning, his body already going stiff in the cold, his face frozen in an expression that might have been fear or relief. Standard procedure was to display the body as an example, to parade the corpse before the regiment with a commissar delivering a speech about the wages of cowardice and the emperor's judgment upon traitors. Instead, Valen had him buried quietly. No ceremony, just a shallow grave marked with a piece of scrap metal that had Corvin's name scratched into it with a bayonet tip. When the colonel asked about the lack of exemplary display, Valen simply said, "He's dead. That's punishment enough." The colonel didn't push it. Maybe because he was too tired, maybe because he'd lost faith in the efficacy of object lessons, maybe because we were all starting to understand that traditional military discipline only worked when soldiers believed the mission had meaning. And it was getting harder to believe that with every day, with every casualty, with every kilometer that brought us no closer to anything that mattered, we started losing men to other things. Suicide. Accidents that were probably suicide but had enough ambiguity to be written up as equipment failure. Mysterious illnesses that the Medicae couldn't diagnose. Soldiers who just stopped functioning, who sat down and wouldn't stand up no matter how many orders were shouted or how many threats were made. The Commissar's duty in those cases was to execute them for cowardice in the face of the enemy. Valen just had them evacuated, sent back to the rear with medical tags that classified their conditions as acute combat stress disorder rather than cowardice. It was the same thing, really, just different paperwork. But the paperwork mattered because it meant they got treatment instead of a bullet, got a chance to recover instead of becoming another object lesson in the price of weakness. I asked him about it once, during one of his walks through the positions. It was late, third watch again, and I was sitting in my fighting hole cleaning my lasgun for the 4th time that day, because cleaning gave you something to do besides think. He sat down on the edge of the hole, his legs dangling into the space, and for a while we just sat there in silence, listening to the distant rumble of artillery fire from somewhere further up the valley. "You're not executing deserters," I said finally. Not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the darkness. "No," he said. "I'm not." "Why?" He turned to look at me, and in the dim light from the lamp pack, I could see how tired he was, how the campaign had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there at the start. "Because I don't know anymore if refusing to die meaninglessly is actually cowardice," he said. "Because maybe the real cowardice is following orders we know are wrong, sending men to their deaths for objectives that don't justify the cost." It was the most heretical thing I'd ever heard a commissar say. Commissars were supposed to be absolute in their faith, unwavering in their conviction that the emperor's will justified any sacrifice. They were the ideological backbone of the Imperial Guard, the living embodiment of duty and obedience. For Valen to question that, to even suggest that an order could be wrong, was to undermine the entire structure that made the Guard function. "You could be executed for saying that," I said quietly. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Could be, should be, probably. But who's going to do it? The colonel? He stopped believing in this mission 2 weeks ago. The other officers? They're just trying to survive long enough to retire with their pensions intact. You?" He looked at me directly. "Would you execute me for telling the truth?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to answer. Because he was right, and we both knew it, and knowing it changed nothing. We'd still advance tomorrow, still follow orders, still send men to die for objectives that made less sense every day. The machinery of the Imperium ground on regardless of individual doubt, powered by momentum and bureaucracy and the sheer weight of institutional inertia. The next major assault came on day 47. The enemy had been quiet for nearly a week, long enough that some of the newer soldiers started believing maybe we'd broken their will, maybe they'd run out of ammunition or reinforcements. The veterans knew better. Silence from the enemy meant they were preparing something, consolidating forces, planning something big. We reinforced our positions, laid additional minefields, established overlapping fields of fire. It wasn't enough. They hit us at dawn, which was tactically sound because it meant attacking out of the sun, making it harder to see them coming. But they weren't coming at us directly. They'd tunneled through the old mining passages, had dug their way beneath our positions, and they came up inside our perimeter, behind our defensive lines, inside the supposedly secure rear area where the support units and wounded were positioned. It was chaos. Close quarters fighting in the half-light, men shooting at shadows, friendly fire incidents, because nobody knew who was who in the confusion. I was on the perimeter when it started, heard the screaming and the gunfire behind me, and had to make the choice to hold position against external threats or abandon my post to help defend the rear. I abandoned my post. Court-martial offense, death penalty if anyone cared enough to prosecute. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the men dying behind me, the panicked voices on the Vox calling for help that wasn't coming fast enough. The fighting lasted 40 minutes. We drove them back eventually, killed most of the infiltrators, and captured a handful who died from their wounds before we could interrogate them. But they'd accomplished their objective, had destroyed most of our heavy equipment, killed or wounded a significant portion of our support personnel. The medici tent was a total loss, burned to the ground with the wounded still inside, their screams cutting through everything until someone had the mercy to shoot them. The ammunition dump was compromised, contaminated with chemicals from a ruptured storage tank, rendering most of our reserves unusable. The Vox equipment was destroyed, leaving us with only short-range units that could barely reach the next company, let alone high command. We'd lost the ability to advance and the ability to retreat. We were stuck 20 kilometers into Keswick Valley, with no reinforcement possible and no mission achievable. We'd become exactly what the enemy wanted us to become, a fixed target, slowly dying, consuming resources that could have been used elsewhere, tying down Imperial forces that could have been deployed to battles that actually mattered. The colonel called another command meeting. There were fewer officers this time, the casualty rate having taken its toll on the leadership. He looked older, somehow, as though he'd aged years in the past 6 weeks. The map behind him showed our position marked in blue, but the enemy positions in red had multiplied, spreading across the display like an infection. High command has been apprised of our situation, the colonel said carefully. Reinforcements are being considered, which meant no reinforcements were coming. Resources in the Imperial Guard flowed toward success, toward battles that could be won, not toward failures that would only consume more men and materiel without producing results. We'd become a write-off, an acceptable loss, a line item in some bureaucrat's report about the Helithos Fort campaign that would note our sacrifice and move on to more important matters. Our orders are to hold position until relieved, the colonel continued. We are to maintain defensive readiness and prepare for extraction when circumstances permit. And if circumstances never permit? That was Commissar Valen, his voice flat and tired. The colonel's eye twitched. Then we hold until we cannot hold any longer, he said. We are soldiers of the Emperor. We do our duty regardless of personal cost, even when our duty is pointless? Valen asked. Even when we're dying for nothing? The tent went silent again. Officers stared at their boots, at the map, at anything except the Commissar who was saying things that could get them all executed if the wrong person heard them. The colonel's face went red, then pale. That is dangerously close to heresy, Commissar, he said quietly. Valen stood, and for a moment I thought he was going to draw his bolt pistol. Thought we were about to witness a Commissar executing a colonel or a colonel ordering a Commissar's arrest, either of which would be the final collapse of whatever discipline held the regiment together. Instead, he just saluted, perfect form, the gesture somehow more insulting than any words could be. "Permission to be dismissed, sir," Valen said. The colonel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Valen left, and the meeting dissolved shortly after. Officers filing out without further discussion, because what was there to discuss? We were going to die here. That was the only certainty. The only question was how long it would take. The enemy settled into a pattern after that. They'd hit us with artillery every few days, random bombardments that were more harassment than serious assault, just enough to keep us from sleeping, to maintain constant stress, to slowly erode our cohesion and capability. They'd send out snipers who'd kill 1 or 2 men, and then withdraw before we could organize a response. They'd launch small raids, probing attacks that tested our defenses without committing serious forces. They were patient. They understood that time was their greatest weapon, that all they had to do was wait for us to collapse from within. And we did collapse, slowly, inexorably. Not in a single catastrophic moment, but in 1,000 small failures, a gradual degradation of everything that made us a functioning military unit. Soldiers stopped maintaining their equipment to standard, stopped shaving, stopped responding immediately to orders. We weren't mutinying, exactly. We were just slowing down, becoming less. Letting the grinding monotony of siege warfare wear away at everything except the basic animal drive to survive one more day. Commissar Valen stopped making his rounds. He stayed in his quarters, emerging only for command meetings and the most serious disciplinary matters. But even those he handled differently now. A soldier who fell asleep on watch, traditionally an execution offense, got a warning. A squad that failed to maintain proper interval during patrol got a lecture instead of decimation. The normal machinery of military discipline, the brutal enforcement mechanisms that kept the Imperial Guard functional, ground to a halt because the man charged with operating them had lost faith in their purpose. I think that was what broke us more than anything else. We could have endured the casualties, the fear, the hopelessness. We'd been trained to endure those things, had been conditioned from our first day in training to push through pain and terror and exhaustion. But we couldn't endure our commissar's doubt. When the man whose job was to believe without question stopped believing, it gave permission for our own doubts to surface, to become real, to transform from treasonous thoughts we kept buried deep into spoken words, conversations held in whispers during the night watch. What were we doing here? Why were we dying for a lithium processing facility on a planet nobody had heard of? How many more of us had to die before someone in high command admitted this mission was a failure? The questions had no answers, but asking them was itself a kind of sedition, a virus that spread through the regiment, infecting everyone it touched. Private Halson shot himself on day 63, put his lasgun under his chin, and pulled the trigger, his body found in his fighting hole during the morning relief. The note he left was simple. "I'm sorry. I just can't anymore." Standard procedure would have been to deny him any funeral rites, to declare him a traitor and cast his body outside the perimeter for the scavengers. Instead, Valen personally oversaw his burial, right next to Corvin and the others who'd chosen death over continuation. He read from the Imperial Creed, the traditional prayers for the fallen, as though Halson had died heroically rather than taking his own life. When the colonel heard about it, he finally snapped. He came storming into the position, his face purple, his eye twitching so fast it looked like a seizure. He found Valen standing by the grave markers, still holding the tattered prayer book he'd been reading from. "You will stop this," the colonel said, his voice shaking with rage or fear or both. "You will stop coddling these men. You will start doing your job, Commissar, or I will find someone who will." Valen looked at him with those grey eyes, and there was something terrible in his expression, something that had been absent before. Not anger, not defiance, just exhaustion so profound it had transcended emotion entirely. "My job," Valen said quietly, is to maintain the morale and discipline of Imperial forces. How, exactly, am I supposed to maintain morale when the situation is hopeless? How do I maintain discipline when following orders means dying for nothing? You maintain them because those are your orders, the colonel shouted. You maintain them because the alternative is chaos. You maintain them because we are soldiers of the God Emperor, and we do not question, we do not doubt, we do not quit. Then why are you here, Colonel? Valen asked. Why are you screaming at me instead of leading your regiment? Why haven't you ordered another advance? Why are we sitting in these positions waiting to die instead of completing our mission? The colonel raised his hand as though to strike Valen, then seemed to remember who he was dealing with, what Valen's position authorized him to do in response to threats from superior officers. He lowered his hand slowly, his shoulders slumping. Because I don't want to send any more men to their deaths, he said quietly. Because I look at what we've accomplished and I see nothing. Because every day I wake up and wonder if this is the day High Command finally admits this operation is a failure and pulls us out, and every day nothing changes. They stood there, facing each other, the colonel and the commissar, both of them broken in different ways by the same grinding futility. After a moment, the colonel turned and walked away, his back bent as though under a great weight. Valen watched him go, then knelt beside Halson's grave and placed his hand on the disturbed earth, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been apology. The final attack came on day 70. We'd been in the valley for 10 weeks, had lost more than 60% of our original strength, had achieved nothing except survival. High Command sent a transmission. Finally, the first direct communication we'd received in 3 weeks. The message was brief. Hold position. Relief force inbound. Estimated arrival 14 days. 14 days. 2 more weeks of this. 2 more weeks of bombardment and fear and slow death. It might as well have been 2 years. 2 centuries. Forever. The enemy must have intercepted the transmission or had their own sources because they attacked that night. Everything they had, a full-scale assault meant to finish us before reinforcements could arrive. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, infantry supported by light armor, waves of them flowing down from the mountains and out of the tunnels, more fighters than we'd imagined they had, more than our intelligence had ever suggested. The artillery started first, a bombardment that made previous ones look like warning shots, shells falling so thick they overlapped, the explosions merging into a continuous roar that obliterated all other sound. We fought because there was nothing else to do, because dying with a weapon in your hand was marginally better than dying cowering in a hole. I fired my lasgun until the power pack ran dry, switched to a new one, fired until that one was empty too. Men were dying around me, cut down by las fire and shrapnel, screaming until they couldn't scream anymore, calling for help that wasn't coming, calling for their mothers, for the Emperor, for anyone who might hear them and care. The defensive line collapsed in sections, squads being overrun and wiped out, the enemy pushing deeper into our perimeter with every minute. I saw Commissar Valen during the fighting, saw him standing in the middle of the chaos without helmet or body armor, his bolt pistol in his hand but not firing it, just standing there as though he'd forgotten what he was supposed to do. A group of enemy fighters were advancing toward his position, maybe 20 meters away, their weapons raised. I screamed at him to take cover, to shoot, to do something. He looked at me, made eye contact across the battlefield, and I saw in his face the same exhaustion I'd seen before but amplified, transformed into something that looked like peace. He raised his bolt pistol. For a moment, I thought he was finally going to fight, going to be the Commissar he was supposed to be. Then he turned the weapon, pressed the barrel against his temple, and pulled the trigger. The bolt round took off the side of his head, the explosive round detonating inside his skull, and he crumpled like a puppet with cut strings, dead before he hit the ground. I don't know why that broke me when nothing else had. I'd seen hundreds of men die over the past 10 weeks, had become numb to death, had learned to keep functioning regardless of how many bodies piled up around me. But seeing Valen kill himself, seeing the man who was supposed to embody faith and duty choose oblivion instead. Something inside me snapped. I dropped my lasgun and ran, not toward the enemy or toward safety because there was no safety, just ran without direction or purpose, a panicked animal flight that ended when I tripped over something, a body, a piece of equipment, I don't know, and fell hard enough to knock the wind out of my lungs. I lay there gasping, waiting for a shot that would end it, almost hoping for it. Instead, rough hands grabbed me, hauled me upright, shoved a weapon into my hands. It was Sergeant Markov from 2nd Squad, his face streaked with blood and soot, his eyes wild. "Get up, Corporal," he shouted over the din. "Get up and fight. We're not done yet." But we were done. Anyone with eyes could see that. The enemy had broken through in multiple places, had established firing positions inside our perimeter, had turned our defensive works against us. It was only a matter of time before they rolled us up completely, killed or captured everyone who remained. Still, we fought, because that's what you did. Because stopping meant dying, and maybe dying while fighting felt better than dying while surrendering. The enemy commander must have decided that we'd suffered enough, because suddenly their forces withdrew, pulled back to the perimeter, and stopped advancing. We stood there in our shattered positions, weapons raised, expecting a final push that never came. Instead, a voice came over the Vox channel, speaking in accented low Gothic. "Imperial soldiers," the voice said, "you have fought bravely, but your cause is lost. Your supply lines are cut. Your reinforcements are not coming. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the conventions of war. Continue fighting, and we will be forced to eliminate you all. You have 1 hour to decide." The colonel's voice came over the Vox shortly after. "All units maintain position. Do not, I repeat, do not surrender. Reinforcements are en route. We hold until they arrive." But his voice was hollow, unconvincing. He didn't believe it any more than we did. The reinforcements weren't coming. They'd never been coming. That transmission about a relief force had been High Command's way of giving us hope to cling to, a psychological tool to keep us fighting a little longer. It was a lie. Just another lie in a campaign built on lies from the very beginning. We didn't surrender, not officially. But we didn't fight either when the enemy resumed their advance an hour later. We just stopped, put down our weapons, walked out of our positions with our hands raised, let them take us without resistance. Some of the officers, the ones who still believed or who were too proud to accept defeat, shot themselves rather than face capture. The colonel was one of them, his body found in the command bunker with his service pistol in his hand and a hole through his palate where he'd put the barrel in his mouth. They loaded us onto trucks, maybe 300 survivors from a regiment that had started with 3,000, and drove us out of the valley, past the lithium processing facilities that we'd died trying to reach, the buildings standing silent and intact, whatever strategic value they supposedly held impossible to see from ground level. The enemy commander, a woman in her 50s with grey hair and a face marked by old burn scars, stood by the roadside watching as we passed. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired, sad almost, as though our suffering brought her no joy but was simply something that had needed to happen. The prison camp was a converted warehouse complex on the outskirts of the main settlement, nothing sophisticated, just chain-link fences and guard towers and rows of prefab buildings where they housed us in groups of 20. The conditions weren't terrible. By guard standards, we'd slept in worse places during the campaign, but it was the purposelessness that ate at you, the knowledge that we'd failed, that everything we'd endured had been for nothing, that men we'd known and fought beside had died achieving exactly zero of value to anyone. I learned later, through the prisoner gossip network that develops in any captive population, that the relief force had been cancelled 3 days after the original transmission. High Command had decided that the Keswick Valley operation was no longer worth the resource investment, that the regiment was expendable, that our deaths could be written off as an acceptable loss in the grand calculus of imperial warfare. We'd been abandoned deliberately, left to die or be captured because extracting us would have cost more than our lives were worth. They kept us for 6 months before the prisoner exchange. The war on Helithos IV had ended in some kind of negotiated settlement, details unclear and probably not important. We were repatriated to Imperial control, processed through the Departamento Munitorum bureaucracy, formally discharged from service, with notations in our records about circumstances beyond the individual's control, which was military speak for captured through no fault of their own. We were given tickets back to our homeworlds, given small pensions, given thanks for our service, and told we were free to resume our civilian lives as though the past year hadn't happened, as though we could simply slot back into society and pretend we hadn't seen what we'd seen, hadn't learned what we'd learned about the Imperium and duty, and the value of human life in the Emperor's calculus. I went back to Ithaca, back to the hive city where I'd been born, back to the district where my family had lived before I'd enlisted. The apartment was still there, maintained by my sister who'd taken over the lease when I left. She welcomed me home, asked careful questions about the campaign that I didn't answer, eventually stopped asking. I got a job in a manufactorum, mindless assembly work that required no thought, that let me stand in one place for 10 hours a day performing the same motions over and over while my mind went somewhere else, anywhere else. But at night, I dream about Keswick Valley, about the mountains like teeth, about the bodies in shallow graves, about Commissar Valen standing in the middle of battle with his bolt pistol raised. I dream about his face in that final moment, the peace that came from finally making a choice, from refusing to participate any longer in the machinery of pointless death. They call it cowardice, I suppose, what he did, desertion by suicide, but I think it was the bravest thing I ever saw, the only honest act in a campaign built on lies. Sometimes I wonder if he was right, if maybe the real cowardice is doing your duty when your duty is wrong, following orders that lead nowhere except to the graves of better men than you. But then I remember that these are treasonous thoughts, heretical questions that undermine the foundations of imperial authority. So I push them down, bury them deep, go to work and perform my duties and pretend that everything makes sense, that serving the Imperium has meaning, that our sacrifices matter. But late at night, when sleep won't come and the memories press in from all sides, I can still see Valen's face in that final moment. I can still hear the roar of that bolt pistol shot, and I understand, finally, what he was trying to tell us with that last act, that there are some orders that shouldn't be followed, that there are some situations where death is the only honest response, that sometimes the greatest loyalty is not to the Emperor or the Imperium, but to the truth of what you've seen, what you've lived, what you know to be real beyond the propaganda and the lies. I'm still a loyal citizen. I pay my tithes, attend services at the local shrine, bow my head when the Ministorum priests speak of duty and sacrifice. But inside, where no one can see, where no commissar can judge and no tribunal can reach, I carry Valen's doubt like a wound that won't heal. I carry the memory of 3,000 men fed into a meaningless war, ground up and spat out by the imperial machinery that sees us as nothing more than ammunition to be expended, resources to be allocated according to strategic calculations that have nothing to do with our lives or deaths or suffering. They tell us that in serving the Emperor we serve humanity, that our sacrifices protect the Imperium from the darkness that surrounds it. They tell us that every death has meaning, that the Emperor values each soul lost in his service. They tell us many things, these priests and commissars and officers who send men to die from positions of safety, who never have to see the faces of the dead, who never have to stand in the valleys they condemn us to. But I was in Keswick Valley. I saw what happens when duty becomes divorced from purpose, when orders flow from bureaucrats who view men as numbers on a requisition form. I saw a commissar, the living symbol of imperial faith, choose death over continued participation in that machine, and I cannot unknow what I learned there in those 70 days of grinding horror, that the Imperium's greatest lie is not that we matter, but that our deaths matter, that there's some grand design that makes our suffering meaningful. There isn't. We die in valleys like Keswick, Because someone made a calculation that spending our lives was cheaper than admitting a mistake, because institutions can't acknowledge failure without undermining their authority. We die because the machinery of the Imperium is too vast to change course, too invested in its own momentum to stop even when it's driving toward cliff edges visible to anyone willing to look. I survived. That's supposed to be something to celebrate, something to be grateful for. But most days, it just feels like a slower form of dying. This life after Keswick, this pretending that everything is normal when you've seen how little normal really means. The Imperium grinds on, sending new regiments to new valleys, repeating the same mistakes because learning from error would require admitting error was possible. And somewhere out there, thousands of light years away, another young Commissar is probably just beginning to doubt, just starting to see the cracks in the edifice of duty, just beginning the journey that Valen completed with a bolt round to the temple. I hope they find more courage than I did. I hope they choose death before complicity, silence before participation. Because the alternative is what I'm living now, this half-existence of going through the motions, performing the rituals of imperial loyalty while knowing they're hollow, while understanding that the Emperor's light casts deep shadows, and in those shadows, men die forgotten and alone for reasons that satisfy no one except the bureaucrats who file their death certificates. That's what I learned in Keswick Valley, what Commissar Valen taught me with his last act, that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is to stop believing, to refuse participation, to say no even when no isn't an option. He's dead now, buried in an unmarked grave in a valley on a world that doesn't matter. His service record probably contains notations about mental breakdown and dereliction of duty. But he was more honest in his final moment than the Imperium has been in 10,000 years of endless war. And I carry that honesty with me. A quiet heresy that colors everything I see, that makes it impossible to hear the propaganda without hearing the lie beneath it, that makes it impossible to see the banners and the glory and the grand speeches without remembering the bodies, the screaming, the men who died begging for their mothers while their organs spilled into the dirt. They say the Emperor protects. Maybe he does, somewhere, for someone. But he didn't protect us in Keswick Valley. Nothing protected us there except our own diminishing numbers. The simple arithmetic of casualty rates that eventually convinced our enemies we weren't worth the ammunition to finish. We survived not through faith or duty but through surrender, through giving up, through admitting defeat. And that's the thought I cannot escape, the idea that maybe Valen understood something the rest of us refuse to see, that sometimes defeat is the only victory possible, that sometimes the bravest thing is to stop fighting, to refuse to feed any more lives into the machine, to step back and say this far and no further. I will not participate in this horror any longer, even if refusing costs me everything. He's dead and I'm alive. And I don't know which of us got the better deal. But I know that every night when I close my eyes, I see that bolt pistol raised to his temple. I see his finger on the trigger. I see the moment of choice, the instant where he decided that death with dignity was preferable to life in service of pointless suffering. And I understand why he made that choice, even if I'm too much of a coward to make it myself. So I work my shift in the manufactorum. I collect my wages, I attend the mandatory services and mouth the words of prayers I don't believe. I live my life as a loyal imperial citizen should, performing my small role in the vast machinery that keeps the Imperium functioning. But inside, where it counts, where the truth of what I experienced can't be erased by propaganda or time or distance, I remain in Keswick Valley. I remain standing in that moment when I watched my Commissar choose death over continued service, when the man who was supposed to embody perfect faith demonstrated perfect doubt instead. They tell us that doubt is weakness, that questioning is heresy, that faith must be absolute or it means nothing. But Valen taught me that maybe the opposite is true, that maybe real strength is admitting when you can't believe anymore, when the weight of what you've seen crushes faith beneath simple honesty. Maybe real courage is saying, I cannot do this, I cannot serve this anymore, I cannot participate in death after meaningless death in service of objectives that justify nothing. I don't know if there's a God Emperor watching over humanity. I don't know if our souls serve him after death as the priests claim. I don't know if there's any meaning to the suffering, any purpose to the endless war that devours generation after generation in service of an imperium that views its citizens as expendable resources. What I know is that I stood in a valley and watched good men die for bad reasons, watched a commissar lose his faith and choose death over hypocrisy, watched the machinery of imperial warfare grind on regardless of cost or consequence, and I know that I'm still here, still alive, still going through the motions of loyal service while carrying inside me the knowledge that it's all built on lies, that the glory is false, that the sacrifice is meaningless, that the Imperium uses us up and spits us out and tells us we should be grateful for the opportunity to die in its service. I know these things and I cannot unknow them, cannot go back to the innocent faith I had before Keswick Valley, before I watched a commissar put a bolt round through his own brain rather than continue perpetuating the lie. So this is what I am now, a survivor who wishes he'd died, a veteran who cannot escape the memories, a loyal citizen who knows the loyalty is performance, a man who goes to work and lives his life and pretends that everything is fine, while inside he's still standing in that valley, still watching his commissar make the choice I couldn't make, still hearing the echo of that gunshot that meant more than any words could. That's what happens when your commissar starts doubting the mission. The doubt spreads like a virus, infects everyone it touches, makes it impossible to maintain the fictions that make military service bearable. And once you've seen behind the curtain, once you've understood how arbitrary and pointless so much of the dying really is, you can't unsee it. You just carry it with you. This knowledge, this weight, this understanding that the Emperor's light is built on mountains of corpses and rivers of blood and the suffering of men who deserved better than to die in valleys that don't matter for causes that can't be justified. I survived Keswick Valley, but in all the ways that matter, in all the ways that make life worth living, I think I died there with the Commissar and the 3,000 others who went into that valley and never came out. What walks around wearing my face and name is just the shell, just the biological machinery that keeps functioning because it doesn't know how to stop. Inside, where I actually live, I'm still there, still in the valley, still watching Valen raise that bolt pistol, still understanding what he understood, that sometimes the only honest response to institutional evil is to stop participating, no matter what it costs. They call it the glory of serving the Emperor. They call it duty and honor and sacrifice. But I know what it really is. I was there. I saw. And I carry that seeing with me into every moment of this half-life I'm living now, this pretending to be normal, this going through the motions while knowing that the motions mean nothing, that beneath the pageantry and propaganda there's just the grinding machinery of an empire that devours its own children and calls it sacred duty. That's the truth. That's what I learned. That's what I cannot unlearn no matter how hard I try to forget, to move on, to accept the comfortable lies that make life in the Imperium bearable. And someday, maybe, I'll find Valen's courage. Maybe I'll make the choice he made, stop pretending, stop performing, stop feeding my life into a machine that values it at nothing. But until then, I work my shift. I collect my wages, I survive, and I remember everything. I remember what faith looks like when it finally, honestly, breaks.